person who told me this story was someone who had been running a podcast about horror and paranormal events on the internet for several years. Even while telling it, he said that remembering that night still made him uncomfortable. The story actually started in a very ordinary way. One evening, while looking for an interesting topic for a new episode, he was browsing through old forums and archive sites. His goal was to find forgotten incidents or strange recordings and talk about them on his show. As the hours passed, he didn't come across anything very interesting. But just as he was about to shut down his computer, he found a strange audio file in an old data archive. The file name was very odd. Just a meaningless combination of numbers and letters. There was no date information either. Curious, he downloaded the file to his computer and started listening with his headphones. At first, the recording made no sense. For about 30 seconds, there was nothing but a broken microphone sound, the noise of wind, and a recording that kept cutting in and out. Just as he was about to close it, he noticed a very faint sound in the background. It was so quiet that at first he wasn't even sure if he had really heard it. The sound was like someone whispering, but the words were impossible to understand. Since he was used to audio editing programs because of his podcast, he loaded the recording into his software and began cleaning the noise and increasing the volume. As the sound became clearer, the whisper in the background started to become more noticeable. But the strange thing wasn't just the whisper. The recording sounded as if it had been made not in a small room, but in a large empty space. It echoed slightly, as if the person speaking was somewhere far down a long corridor, talking toward the microphone. For several minutes, he listened to the recording again and again. Every time, the same whisper appeared at the same point. As his curiosity grew, he started cleaning the sound even more. When he applied stronger filters and adjusted the frequencies, the words slowly began to emerge. The first thing he heard sounded like the first syllable of his own name. He paused for a moment, but assumed it was just a coincidence. The human brain sometimes turns meaningless sounds into words that seem familiar. So he analyzed the recording several more times, but every time he listened, he heard the same thing. The whisper was actually saying his name. When he realized this, he laughed at first. He thought it was a funny coincidence. Maybe the person who made the recording was calling someone who simply had the same name as him. But the sentence that followed a few seconds later started to make him uneasy. The whisper said very slowly in a muffled voice, "If you are listening to this." At that point, he stopped the recording. He stared at the screen for a moment. A strange feeling formed inside him, but curiosity still won. He played the recording again and increased the volume a little more. The whisper continued, "Don't look behind the door." When he first heard this sentence, he thought to himself that it was ridiculous, because at that moment he was completely alone in his room. He was sitting in a small workspace, and the door was directly behind him. For a few seconds he tried not to look back, but eventually he turned and glanced at the door out of reflex. The door was closed, and nothing seemed unusual. He laughed to himself. He assumed he had simply found an old horror recording. Maybe someone had created something like this years ago and uploaded it online. Actually, this kind of thing could make good material for his podcast. So he decided to save the recording and use it for the next episode. But at that exact moment, he heard a very faint clicking sound from the door behind him. At first, he thought it was just one of the normal sounds old buildings make. Sometimes doors move or shift on their own. But a few seconds later, the same sound happened again. This time, it was clearer. It sounded as if someone had lightly touched the door handle. A strange uneasiness began to grow inside him. He removed his headphones and sat silently for a few seconds. The house was completely quiet. No sounds came from the hallway or from any other room. After waiting a moment, he convinced himself that it was only his imagination and turned back to the computer. He decided to listen to the recording one more time. But this time, he noticed something different. The length of the audio file had changed. Originally, the recording was about 1 minute long, but now it showed 1 minute and 10 seconds. At first, he thought it was just a software glitch, but he played the recording until the end. A new section had been added, and in that section, the whisper appeared again, but this time, it was much clearer. "Don't look behind you." The moment he heard that sentence, he instinctively turned around. The door was still closed, but the light from the hallway that usually came through the bottom of the door was gone. It was completely dark, as if the hallway light had suddenly been turned off. The uneasiness inside him was now turning into real fear. He stared at the door for a few seconds, then turned back to the computer and checked the information of the audio file. What he noticed at that moment completely froze him. The file's creation date showed that very day. In fact, it showed a time just a few minutes earlier. It was as if the recording had been created right then, but he had downloaded that file from the internet. For a few seconds, he couldn't think at all. He just stared back and forth between the screen and the door. Then, he tried to convince himself that it must be a virus or a system error. Just as he was about to shut down the computer, the door handle slowly moved. Click. The door didn't open, but the handle was clearly pushed downward. He told me that he couldn't stand up at that moment. It felt as if his body had completely locked. After a few seconds, the door handle slowly returned to its normal position, as if nothing had happened. But the audio file on the computer was still open, and the recording suddenly started playing again by itself. This time, the whisper sounded much closer. "It saw you." While the podcast host was telling me this story, I could hear his voice trembling. He said he didn't open the door that night. He stayed in his room for hours and waited until morning. When the sun came up, he thought the fear had finally passed. But the last thing he told me was truly disturbing. When he left the room in the morning, he looked at the door. On the inside of the door, right at eye level, there was a sentence written in the dust, as if someone had traced it with a finger. And the sentence said, "I was watching you last night."